So we are joined today, as I said, by Dr. Chenxi Wang, founder and general partner of Rain Capital. So with that, I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Dr. Wang and thank you for being here today. You know, you have a busy schedule, so we so appreciate you taking time to meet with students, staff, and faculty. So as a starting point, you know, as I said, we've all had an opportunity to read your bio and your background and very impressive career history thus far. We've also seen that you did start your career at Carnegie Mellon University. And for those of you who are part of the Women in Information Networking Institute, we actually have the co-founder of that with us today. So lots of history with CMU as well as in the industry. So I'd love to just start by having you tell us, just in your own words, a little bit about your career journey that we didn't get a chance to see in the bio. And we'd love to just hear from you on that.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thank you for having me. First of all, so glad to be back with the CMU community, and hello, Pittsburgh, which was my home for a number of years. I still miss the time I spent in Pittsburgh. And let's see, where do I start? I've done a lot of different things, it seems like. As Lauren pointed out, I started my career in academia, as the first job I took after I got my PhD. And I was a research faculty, became associate professor at ECE, and also was a Scilab faculty. And it was during the Scilab years, Dina and I co-founded Winnie. I still have a picture of me and Dina in the first Winnie get-together with our Winnie shirts, and it was the first ice cream social. I thought about finding that picture to display here, but I wasn't organized enough to do that, but perhaps so we can do that next time. So like she said, CMU, I have a lot of history with CMU. After my academic years, so I spent about 6 years at CMU and did a lot of different things. To me, and one question folks always ask me is, why did you leave academia and went to industry? A number of different reasons. One reason is my husband had moved away to joining Google in Silicon Valley. So that was one of the personal reasons. But in terms of professional reasons, I was always very interested in seeing technology being deployed in real life scenarios. So I spent a summer out here while I was faculty at CMU. I spent a summer out here with HP Labs as a visiting scientist, and I looked at that time a number of different projects that HP Labs was working on. I was very inspired by how well some of these products and technologies solved real problems, and that became sort of the pivot in interest for me to join industry. So I came out to the Silicon Valley and did a startup quite a number of years ago. I think it's 2006. And after that, I joined Forrester Research as the head of security research and principal analyst covering security market. Now, that's a very interesting change from academic research to industry research, because in the latter, what we focused on was market trends, market momentums, in addition to technology. So that line of work allowed me to have a very different perspective on the creation of a technology, the process of which taking technology to market, which I have to say it came handy today, those experiences, right? So from my academic days to today as a Silicon Valley-based investor, I also sit on boards of companies. I'm on a public utility company board doing corporate governance, which is also, maybe we'll get chance to talk a little bit about that later on in the discussion here, taking on very different roles, than my university days, and it's been a very interesting journey.
It was a great introduction and will give us a lot to talk about today. So how we're going to handle the rest of the Q&A portion is I've taken all of the pre-submitted questions that you all submitted in advance when you registered for today's talk. And we're going to use those to talk about a variety of topics from Chenxi's life and career to cybersecurity related questions, and then of course her stellar venture background and investment background. So we'll talk about all of those topics today. If you have questions that come up along the way that you'd like to ask Dr. Wang, please include them in the chat box, and we'll be going over some of those as we have time at the end. So as you were talking, I was just thinking about all the different things you mentioned, and looking at your bio, you've had all sorts of range of experiences. Can you just talk a little bit about what are some of the challenging times that you've had or failures you've had along the way, and how did you handle those? How did you go about navigating some of the difficulties in your career as you went and made several different transitions along the way?
Right. So I've had a career that took me from one role to another, and not always on a very straight trajectory, right? And it may not be the same trajectory as many of you will be taking on. There's good and bad in trying your hands at different roles. The good thing is I'm always learning. One thing I said often is that if I spend 5-6 years in a role and you get good at it, and then it became less interesting because it's not as challenging, you're not learning as much. So for me, being able to learn and being able to feel that there's room to grow is really important to me. So that probably is the underpinning of why I went from one path to another. But there's also the cons is that when you enter a new line of work or line of business that is sufficiently different from what you were doing before, then you're the new kid on the block, right? And how do you go from that to a successful segment of a career? That is an interesting thing to think about. And I know a lot of people think differently along those lines. And for me, there have been cases in the past where I was taking on a role, and in about maybe 7-8 months into it, you're kind of like, this is not a great fit for my capabilities, my what I'm inspired to do, and that becomes a challenge in how you deal with it, right? The times in my career that has happened, I would say 2 things that I have done that helped me. One is if it's going to fail, let it fail early, let it fail fast, and don't look back. Secondly is, if it's possible, turn this challenge into an opportunity. And that has happened many times with me, where I took away interesting learning or interesting skill set that I've learned from dealing with this challenge that was useful later. An example, so recently, obviously, COVID has been a big thing in everybody's lives. And so same as a lot of folks, I went into shelter in place in March, and actually still in shelter in place 7 months later. But as I was going through that initial period of adjusting to life in isolation, so I was thinking about what kind of things I could do to break that mold of being isolated from other people. So I started a women executive group. And I had this idea of starting this group several years ago, but we could never pull it off because everybody was always busy and always traveling. And guess what? With COVID, we were all at home, and I was able to put together a group of extremely accomplished senior women in high tech, and started out as a social group, and now we're meeting every 2 weeks. We talk about career development, we network, we share opportunities, and this is a group of women that is C-level at large enterprise, some of the largest in the country and in the world. And we just started in mid-April to now, right? And already this group, we're getting board opportunities, advisory opportunities, and collaborations happening with that group. So this is an example of opportunities growing out of an unforeseen challenge.
So that's a good segue into a question that was asked several times ahead of time, which is, how do you grow opportunities out of challenges? But more specifically for these students, they're all dealing with a global pandemic and being students and searching for jobs and internships and thinking about what will their next left or right turn be. So what advice do you have for students who are currently in this situation? How might you help them navigate, or how might you advise that they navigate the next steps in their own career in the midst of this pandemic?
Yes, I think it is difficult when you are isolated and you're trying to reach out, establish connections and networking for your job opportunities, right? So the thing I would advise is that if you have a network already, it doesn't matter if it's your friends, your family, go deep in that network, discover new connections, asking folks to introduce you to other folks and who may have opportunities for you. That's one. Second is look at, if you're part of CMU community, look at folks who graduated before you, especially, for the I&I community. I know Dina runs a very, very well-run alumni network. So potentially leverage that network to help you getting closer to connections you want or opportunities. So it really is about being creative, and you have to explore further the existing connections you have and put yourself out there.
It's very fitting for today's Tartan Community Day, which is very focused on obviously our Carnegie Mellon community, but also extending outside of Carnegie Mellon. And so you spoke a lot about your networks and creating new networks and new opportunities for women in technology, and also just even when you were at Carnegie Mellon. So thank you for sharing all of that. We also have a lot of questions just about your startup journey. So many students at the CMU Silicon Valley campus are interested in entrepreneurship and venture capital and in pursuing investments. So lots of curiosity there. Can you talk a little bit about how you started Rain Capital and founded and decided to have this vision for Rain Capital? What was that journey?
Sure. So as we said earlier, that I've done a lot of different roles, operators, large companies, researcher, and executives. The one thing that I had not done extensively is investing. So I was interested in learning more on the investment side. And at that time, I was doing angel investment, so sort of as a hobby. And a few of the angel investments really have produced a really good outcome, so got me more interested into it. And as I exited my last full-time job, looking at what I wanted to do next, so there was a decision to be made. Do I go full-time into investing? And so I was a little apprehensive because I have not done that before. It will be my first time attempting to raise a fund. And a lot of people said it cannot be done because I didn't have the financial background. I wasn't in investment. So for someone with my background, coming cold to raise a fund would be difficult. And we did it. It's not easy. It wasn't a walk in the park, but we did it against I would say against all odds. So I guess the merit from that story is sometimes a challenge or a goal could seem so insurmountable, could seem so far out of reach. But as you start to actually executing, start chipping away a little bit at a time towards that goal, it may become not so insurmountable anymore. And that was really my experience. And so it's a goal I set for myself, and I was able to achieve it. But looking back, if I wasn't able to achieve it, I would have learned a tremendous amount, as I'm doing now as well, about the venture space and what it takes to raise a fund, what it takes to manage the fund. And so that would be time well spent.
Can you talk a little bit about the focus of your investment portfolio and also what factors you consider in your investment decisions?
So I'm a cybersecurity person. I spent many years in this space. So my fund is about finding interesting new cybersecurity technology and products that we can help to take to market. So that's the focus. And in terms of making investment decisions, every investor has a framework, right? And the framework can be slightly different, but by and large, what you're looking at is how big the market is, how compelling the problem it is that the solution is tackling, how good is the team, and lastly is, do they have a good set of technology that gives them that enough moat that other people can't just copy their product easily. So that's the entry barrier for entry. So these four things typically are the meta level aspects that we look at, and obviously there are nuances and everything, but that is my framework, if you will.
And you've spent, as you said, a great deal of time in your career building toward a stellar career in cybersecurity and being known as someone who's a leader in the field. So can you talk a little bit about this sort of your investment portfolio, but also just your background? I mean, what do you see being some of the most exciting, evolving trends in cybersecurity that we're potentially going to see on the market?
Yeah, I think, so if you think about security industry and many of you in I&I, so you have you've been exposed to security market and security technology anyway. Traditionally speaking, cybersecurity was a very simple market, right? So you've got antivirus on your endpoints, you've got firewalls on your network, and that's it. You call it a day. It's no longer the case because the attacks have become a lot more sophisticated, and your infrastructure, of which you run your applications and store your data, has become a lot more complex. And those two things combined gave cybersecurity really the fuel that needed to become a very, very active market. So one of the very central theme we look at is what are the new tech that has the potential of change the way companies deploy applications and run their infrastructure. Right? So give you an example. Cloud is obviously a new tech, and the grand scheme of things is new, that completely disrupted the way IT computing is being done. Other things are big data is another one, right? Even though those are meta level items, if you think about the trickle down effect of that approach to specific technology strategy, to specific products, it's tremendous. So traditional security products and technologies are not suitable to run in the cloud environment. They simply aren't. And because of that, every single piece of security product needs to be re-engineered for the cloud. And hence, that's innovation opportunity, that's investment opportunity. Right? So I invested in a company that was leading the market in container security. And this company, within 4 years, produced a tremendous exit, which is probably one of the fastest exits that we've seen, because they came to the market and recognized a problem at the right time and produced a solution that allows companies to run their workloads in the cloud very easily and seamlessly. And that kind of new approach to security problems is what we're looking for.
So when you're looking at startups and companies to invest in and people, you're looking at, you mentioned the team and entrepreneurs. I mean, how do you see yourself empowering the entrepreneur? What role do you see yourself playing, empowering the entrepreneur and the team?
Yeah. So I should say that before I became a professional investor, I have done a lot of advisory roles for companies. So I've been on advisory boards or advisory teams for entrepreneurs for many, many years. So in that role, I was more of an advocate for the entrepreneurs. I was the sounding board, and sometimes I'm the psychologist, if you will, if they need that mental support, that both from strategy and from the mindset wise. But as an investor, the role is actually a little bit different, because not only I'm an advocate, I'm also a someone who checks their progress, right? Because they need that. Sometimes I need to apply pressure in addition to being their sounding board, being their advocate. And so balancing those two roles are actually sometimes could be tricky, but at the end of the day, we're all working towards the same goal, right? We, the entrepreneurs and my team, want the company to be successful. So based on that goal, we have a lot of commonality to discuss approaches, to bounce off ideas, and to collectively come to the right strategy for the company.
So you talked about how you, as the investor, as well as the team and the founders, you all want it to be successful, right? But on the flip side, I mean, so what advice do you have for startups for the kinds of pitfalls and mistakes to avoid with new ventures?
Yeah, I mean, there are many, to be honest, depending on the space you're in, the sector you're in, right? And I think first-time entrepreneurs, you probably get a ton of advice from everyone. And the trick is to find your own way of doing things that makes sense for your company. So for instance, one of the traditional sales models, and I don't know if you guys are interested in sales models, but that is a very critical aspect for making a business. A traditional mindset for sales is that, okay, if I want to make $5 million next year, what I do is I hire, 5 sales reps, pay them a lot of money, and give them $1 million quota each, and tell them, look, you got a year to prove that you are worth the money we're paying you, and putting a lot of pressure on them and make sure they produce their quota. That is the wrong approach in today's enterprise environment, because it's not about having boots on the ground. It's really about how you reach your audience. And in today's world, the avenues of which you generate demand, you generate interest for your technology is far beyond putting boots on the ground. So that is a very classic mistake that companies make. Another pitfall that I see a lot with early stage founders, especially with first time founders, is that you typically have a good idea or a good piece of technology. That does not equate to having a good product. A good product takes care of the end-to-end experience of the user who comes in contact with the product. Not just an engine, not just many lines of code. And I would say a lot of technology founders don't immediately recognize that. And they feel that, my technology is so superb. Of course you want to buy my product, but they don't understand that from the user standpoint, what's really important is the experience when they come in contact with a product. And that often makes or breaks a product, and consequently makes or breaks a company.
So that was a helpful general description, and you also talked about some of the nuances based on domain and which market you're in. Can you talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls that are common within cybersecurity startups?
Yeah, in cybersecurity, I think one of the things that we see a lot and as a mistakes, and people continue to make them, is that building your cybersecurity product really just for cybersecurity people. So you're making the explanation very terse. Your policies are very domain specific. You lose the sight that oftentimes the users of your product is not necessarily security people. So for instance, if you're an AppSec product, application security, then you want the developers to be part of your user base. If you want the developers to use your product, you cannot use security terminology. You cannot extensively use security terminology, or use the way the workflow has to make sense for the other population. So that's a very common mistake that security products or security entrepreneurs would make. And these days, with DevOps, with cloud native, we see the blurry of responsibilities and roles between cybersecurity and DevOps, or sometimes cybersecurity and infrastructure. So it's really I would say, a great mindset shift. If you can think about how to engineer a security product that is for non-security folks, then you've got a good way of expanding your market presence.
That is a great segue into another question that was asked a lot. And the theme was kind of around, what do you see being the biggest threats to, they said normal people, but I would imagine they mean non-security people, or just kind of your everyday folks. What are some of the common cybersecurity threats that we face in our day-to-day life?
Well, sort of as a citizen, your biggest threat is someone take over your identities, or someone who successfully fish your credentials and are able to either do something harmful financially to you or reputationally, right? And that is, I think, that kind of threat's always there. As you go from different roles in your company or your career, sometimes you'll see it more than others. I know that some of my friends who are in the financial controller position or CFO position for companies are very, very careful about what they do, because they are, they have access to millions of dollars or the company's budget, and a mistake they make could be detrimental. So all of us needs to be concerned about our personal sort of well-beings within the cyberspace. But as a professional, what you do with your company in this world also matters a huge amount.
So we talked a little bit about how earlier, this is kind of now going back to the broader, company or startup concepts, but you talked about new ventures within cybersecurity that you're excited to invest in and where you see that evolving. But just in general, do you have any insights you could provide that would be just how do you think the cybersecurity industry in general is going to evolve over the next few years?
I think the one of the very interesting trends is automation. So in security, a lot of times we solve problems by having security analysts. So someone look at logs, look at events, and determine whether there's a breach or whether there's an incident. But that's sort of the last year's approach, right? Today, we're looking at computing that is extremely scalable. Hence, anything that manages that computing workloads have to be scalable as well, including security. So security technologies are being asked to provide real-time assurance, scalability that is beyond what we've seen before. So automation, horizontal scalability are the two requirements, if you will, are very, very important for today's users and today's applications. So those two are, I would say, every entrepreneur who's looking at security markets should keep in mind.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I want to pause the questions that were submitted in advance. I've received a few in my private chat box. If you all have questions who are on the call right now, please feel free to send them through the chat box. And one question that came in is, monetizing emerging technology products is quite a task. That is what this person says that they're hearing. So as an investor, what do you look for in a company with respect to a startup's ability to get its customers to pay?
Okay. So I have maybe a somewhat controversial answer to that question. I think if you are in the position that you think you have a great piece of tech and your customers are not willing to pay, perhaps that piece of tech's not so great after all. You really have to think about whether the problem you're addressing is compelling enough. Because if it is, people will pay, right? They may not pay at the level you want them to pay, but they will pay because you take away the pain that they're not going to want to go back and say, okay, I embrace the pain. Right? So there are times your monetization strategy is off, which you should take a look at anyway. But the core of the problem is, are you tackling an area that is compelling enough that people will be happy to pay you money to take the problem away? I hope that answers the question.
It seemed like it did. If you, the student who submitted that, if you have other follow-up questions, please feel free to send them to me. So please feel free to continue sending your questions in the chat box. And one question I actually thought of when you were talking about, you mentioned I&I. So we have a number of students on this call who are part of the Information Networking Institute who study cybersecurity. Many of you study security. We also have some students on the call who are interested in things like product management and electrical and computer engineering, but who have an interest or maybe sort of like a curiosity towards security. So can you speak to those students who maybe haven't had an opportunity to take a cybersecurity class or who have not been exposed to this space? What might you advise them if they have a curiosity in this?
So I think I was just on another call yesterday talking about career trajectory for folks that are entering the cybersecurity or enterprise software market. If you don't have the exposure to the technology or engineering side, if you're not a security trained person, can you make a successful career in security, for instance? I think it's absolutely possible. So let's take the example of product management. So what is product management? Product management, largely speaking, you're not expected to write code. You're not an engineer, you're not creating code. But what you're doing is listening to the market, understand what potential users want, consolidate that input into something that the engineering team can understand, and channel that input back to engineering and guide them through the product evolution process. Now, in that process, you have to make a case, right? So product management is about, okay, I think the product should go that direction. Why? What's the evidence? What's the data behind? How, if we build this way, how much are we able to charge customers? All these are investigative questions that may or may not require a technical degree or technical background to answer, but it requires someone is very inquisitive, ask intelligent questions, very analytical. And I think those disciplines are very common across many different academic principles. So you don't have to have a security background to be a good security product manager or have a successful career in cybersecurity.
Very helpful insight. And along the same lines, I'm going to jump back into the chat box in a second, but this just came to mind as I was thinking about career trajectories. One of the other common things that we hear from students is sort of a concern of taking what's perceived to be a risk in joining a startup. So whether that's like as a first-time job or, right out of college or an internship. And so, even from whether it's in cybersecurity or not, what advice do you have? Oh, and I should also say, if we have a lot of students who are here on a visa, and so there's concerns like maybe on an F1 visa, it's really considered risky to join a startup. So how might a student who's interested in entrepreneurship and startups in this space, how might they look at a company and evaluate whether or not it's a good one, quote unquote, to join?
So this question has many different layers for an answer. So I would take the visa question first. I was also myself, so I came from China many years ago. So the ability of me being able to acquire a long-term visa to stay in the country was important to me. So at that time, I was not going to take a job with a company who could not sponsor my visa, right? And that's a very realistic concern. And I would say if that's a concern, then you absolutely need to go with companies that have the ability to sponsor you, right? And that typically means slightly larger companies, unfortunately, right? But there are also startups that are somewhat larger. Now, I would say having been on the West Coast for a long time, our notion of startup is different than maybe the East Coast notion of a startup. Last year, I was on a panel with a CEO on the East Coast that her company is somewhat small, and they've been around for probably 5 years. And I referred to her company as a startup, and she was not happy. She's like, we're not a startup. We are a established company, because she thinks startup as a negative term, while I think of it as a complimentary term. So that's a bit of cultural background for you. Now, in terms of if that's not a concern, meaning that sponsorship of visa is not a concern, then I would say startup, maybe there are risks, but what kind of risks are you really matter to you when you are 21, 22, right? So I think when you're at that age, the best thing you could do for yourself is find the best opportunity to learn. Not about getting the most stable job, because the stable job can be boring, right? And when you're younger, you want to take risks. You don't want to take risks when you have a family to feed, right? So my advice is, if you find something that's interesting, even though if it's a small startup, go for it. Now, the visa question notwithstanding, I think that's a different discussion. But if that's not in the picture, I would say take the most risky thing that will give you the best learning opportunity, because you will be glad later that you've done this and you've learned and you've acquired all these experience that you would not been able to do it otherwise. And there are always boring large company jobs to be had.
Love it. Brent, wonderful. Yeah. So, and I just thank you for sharing your own experience of being here on a visa and then exploring your next steps too. It's helpful to hear just your own unique trajectory and how you got where you are. So, there's a couple of questions that came through that are some good questions. So we'll ask the first one, which is, what is your perspective on startups who try to balance services with product? Does it redact from either one, especially when services can buffer immediate revenue when product is still being developed? Good question, Mike.
That is a very good question. And I would say whoever asked that probably has spent some time in the startup world, or at least thinking about it. So that's a tough question, I would say. If you are an entrepreneur or your executive team, you're facing that question, because yes, when you deliver services, you get immediate revenue, which is sometimes can be much, much needed for your company if you're facing immediate shutdown, for instance. However, there is services can be a double-edged sword, because if you are set out to be a product company and you find yourself in the position having to deliver services, and it's dangerous in the sense that the customer will say, hey, I'll pay you 100K if you just do this, right? And it might be interesting and it'll bring immediate revenues, but it drags you away from your core mission, which is building that product. I would say a little bit is fine. And also services can help you learn what customers want within the product. So that kind of insight is good to have. But at some point, you have to make a decision. Are you a services company or are you a product company? Because very few startups can do both. If you're a large company, you may have a service arm and a product arm. They have separate profit losses they can manage separately. But as a small company, it's very difficult to do well in both. So if you want to become a services company, then forget about the product. If you want to be a product company, then you have to be very judicious of which service contract that you take on. I would say only those that helps you accelerate the core mission of product delivery, you'll do it. Otherwise, either outsource to somebody else or say no.
Wonderful. Great insights and really good question, Mike. Another question came through from Philip, who asks, how much of the opportunity in the cybersecurity industry is in newer tech-driven industries, which may be more concerned with security versus more traditional businesses? For context, this person received an email yesterday from Barnes & Noble regarding a security breach. Another good question.
Yes, a very good question. So I can tell you, hands down, the traditional businesses have deeper pockets. Right. So if you sell a product to Bank of America, for instance, you'll be able to charge a much higher ticket price than you sell to a small startup in San Francisco who's cloud native. Now, that said, if you always cater to the traditional businesses, then your product tends not be the most exciting, tends not to address the next generation of infrastructure. So that is a risk that you're facing. So while as an investor, I look at a lot about those new companies in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, what they're deploying, right? And that's cloud native opportunities, using that as a guidance of where the industry is moving in a few years, but may not necessarily be today. So if you want to build a large business, you still have to cater to some of the traditional industries and traditional businesses, but keeping an eye on where new tech is moving is extremely important.
So one question that came through my private chat box, which is a little bit more timely for this week, is that Twitter has generated a lot of controversies when it blocked the circulation of suspected hack and leak content published by New York Post this week. It illustrates the complexity of cybersecurity that goes beyond technology, involving policy, response, and human judgment. How do you see the cybersecurity industry evolving and working with other disciplines to better deal with this growing complexity?
Very, very good question. So one thing I find fascinating working in the cybersecurity industry is that this industry does have human impact, right? What we do, innovation on the technology side can impact our everyday lives, you and I and my parents, for instance, right? So I've looked at, for instance, I looked at last week a product that is anti-phishing for seniors. And I think it's a very interesting product. The fact that our industry protects people's lives and their data, for me is an altruistic aspect of what I do, and really it really inspires me from time to time. Now, the adjacent aspects like social impact, privacy, societal impact are some things that more and more so we see in the deployment of technologies and the go-to-market strategies of technologies, more so than what it was before. I would say 15 years ago, security products is all about just bits and bytes, right? And today, you have to think about whether your product protects the right community, or your product has, or your algorithm, maybe your algorithm have a bias that you need to be aware of, right? And where do you get your data? How do you protect your data? All those have societal impact. And as a security product, you're no longer a isolated island. So you have to be working with maybe a diverse community to pull together the product. And the best advice I have is getting these viewpoints early on in the product development lifecycle, having build a diverse team, having diverse voice on your advisory board, helping you see things in a different perspective will be really important.
Right, wonderful. So there's a couple more questions. One student asked about, we talked a little bit about how the pandemic has impacted, you as an individual, how it's impacted students or how it might impact students. And now there's a question that is, how do entrepreneurs or how have entrepreneurs had to adjust to the way they work during this pandemic?
Yes. So this pandemic is really interesting because it's, I call it the violent shake to the system. You have to find new ways of doing business, new ways of connecting with your team, your customers. But what is coming out of it, I think it's also extremely interesting in that we see new business models being produced, new communication platforms emerge. I have so many companies that I work with tell me that we are no longer going to be a centralized company. Right? So today we hire people anywhere in the US, for instance, and they can stay where they are after the pandemic. We have no plans to move them to a centralized location. And I think that's becoming more and more of an accepted mindset, an accepted operating model for companies. So we'll see much more distributed workforce going forward, and potentially that has impact on leveling the playing field, right? For maybe for the community that's further away from places like Silicon Valley, for instance, to be able to have access to Silicon Valley jobs, to be able to train at the same level, to see innovations, be exposed to innovations at the same intensity as people here. I think that's a good thing. I personally is very in favor of that. And as an entrepreneur, you just have to get used to it. I think seize the opportunity, right? So. And that is the definition of entrepreneurship, is doing things differently, doing new things. and not to be locked in the old archaic ways of doing things. So these days companies are being formed without the founders having met each other in real life. Millions of dollars being invested without the investors met the founders in real life, which are all inconceivable before the pandemic, but it is happening now.
And as you said earlier on, Dr. Wang, we've been in this shelter in place now for 7 months, all of us, and now some things are starting to open back up, but we are adjusting to a new way of living and existing. And that was actually what sparked the theme for this Tartan Day, which is on rest and rejuvenation, because we've been kind of go for the last 7 months, whether it's like startups trying to and companies trying to pivot, or students trying to figure out how to adjust to like being remote. So, bringing it back to this theme, I'm even thinking about just how to start your own company. It takes work, time, energy. I mean, there's like this image of the entrepreneur under a desk for 24 hours a day. So you talked to us a little bit about rest and this theme of rest and rejuvenation in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of when we're talking about starting a company where it requires so much time and due diligence. So how do you think about the concept of rest?
Yes. Entrepreneurship is a challenging thing to do. Building a company requires 110% of your attention, if you will. And it's a very difficult thing to do, and it's not for everyone, I would say. I am part of a group that actually is looking at entrepreneurs' well-being. So we have we run a series of meetings and get-togethers to help each other with stress relief and with best practices of mindfulness, for instance, right? I think that's really important to have a community of support that helps you through those kind of issues. With the pressure of building a company, right? So for instance, as a CEO, the pressure of a CEO faces is very different than the pressure of an employee. As an employee, you may have the pressure of, the company may go bankrupt and I have to go find another job, right? The CEO, I would say, is several folds larger, the pressure. So for instance, if your product is not selling, you still have to pay your payroll. Right? You can't just tell your workforce, hey, I don't have money. Where do you get the money to pay them? Because there's so many families are relying on the paycheck. So that kind of pressure can be very crushing, I would say, at times. So it's extremely important to take time off and connect with your family and friends, connect within yourself, be introspective about what things that you've accomplished that are well received, be proud of your achievements, and also take time to say, hey, I need a little bit of time for myself, to have a quiet time, to rejuvenate, go on a retreat, a small, half day or even 2-day retreat. To be away from work. It's all very, very important things to do. So I actually have a question for the I&I students. So with this, I assume CMUs also don't have in-person classes these days, right?
We're currently in hybrids. So some students come to campus and some stay home and work remotely.
What about international students? Do they stay? Do they go back to their own countries?
So depends on the student. So some students have stayed in their home country. Some students are local. So we do have students who will be watching this from India, from China, from Mexico, who are juggling being abroad while taking classes from the United States. So it really depends on the student. We have them all over the globe right now.
Yeah, see that in itself is extremely interesting scenario to manage, right? And I would say it's a difficult one, probably more so for I&I than other departments in CMU, right? Because you have more international students, right?
Yeah, majority of our departments here are international students, so I would agree that there's a lot that they're juggling and dealing with visa issues and trying to get here. So we're glad that everyone's making it work, and we're happy that they're all here. Um, with that, I know we only have a couple minutes left, but Dr. Wang, you kind of already started to this, but I'd love to just hear if you have any like final parting words or a summary that you'd like to share with the students as we close out today's session.
So, yeah, I would say that life is really interesting. This year you've seen very, very interesting disruption to everybody's lives. But one thing I think it remains constant is that no matter where you are, which walk of life you come from, there are opportunities to be had if you work hard and if you make smart decisions. And many, many years ago, I was like one of you, came to the US with very little money, but a degree and a desire to pursue higher education. And so I carved my path, and I'm sure many of you will carve your own path and be very successful.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's an excellent closing statement. So just a huge thank you. I know if you were in person, you would hear a round of applause. But since everybody's muted right now, I can just imagine everyone's at home clapping. But thank you so much, Dr. Wang, for your time and for sharing all of your insights with students, staff, and faculty at CMU. So I was glad to have you back with the CMU community. And to all of you, thank you for joining today's Fireside Chat with Dr. Chenxi Wang.
Thank you for having me.